Hello everybody, I'm Brainy Diode, and you may remember that a few weeks ago I put up a video in which I said I had something in mind to help myself get better at critiquing things. And here it is. This is the announcement and first episode of So I Just Watched, which is a movie review series that I'm going to be doing because why not? Who's going to stop me? This is might get a little bit rambly. So far I don't plan on doing like outright scripts for these reviews. Honestly, they're more of impression videos than actual reviews because I'm probably just going to be seeing the movie once before doing each one. And it will probably get a little bit rambly because I don't have a script down to the word. I just have basically a vague outline of what I want to talk about that I'm looking at here. So apologies in advance if it gets a little bit rambly, but other than that, without further ado, so I just watched Promare. Promare is the first feature film by Studio Trigger and the creative teams behind Gurren Lagann and Kill La Kill. And my goodness, can you tell who made this movie? Ultimately, the amount of enjoyment you're going to get out of this movie will depend heavily upon how much of a pass you're willing to give it for the typical Studio Trigger-y-ness of the movie. I mean, if you've seen Gurren Lagann and Kill La Kill and liked either of them, you're probably going to enjoy this movie. If you haven't, it'll depend. It really depends on how much of a pass you're willing to give to things like a little bit of Deus Ex Machina here and there, a little bit of spectacle for spectacle's sake, some last-second power-ups. I wouldn't say it's overwhelming in this movie, but those are definitely there. So if that's an immediate turnoff for you for a movie, I would say you're probably going to want to give this movie a pass. That's not what I meant to say. You're probably going to want to pass on this movie if those kinds of things are an immediate no for you. But if you're able to look past them a little bit more, I think there's a lot to enjoy from this movie. Another aspect of it that I noticed was, just like Gurren Lagann and just like Kill La Kill, for some reason, the first and second halves of the movie feel like very distinct entities. Like there's a definite crossing point when you've gone from the first half of the movie to the second half of the movie, and that makes it a little bit weird to recommend to people because the first half of the movie I think is absolutely phenomenal, almost no matter who you are. It is very easy for me to recommend the first half of the movie to just about anybody, or it would be if the first half of the movie was the whole movie. But unfortunately, if you're going to have problems with the movie, then they're probably going to be in the second half, because the second half of the movie just goes a little bit wild, and you get a lot of standard Studio Trigger nonsense in there that I can definitely see turning a lot of people off from this movie. So that being said, as someone who loved Gurren Lagann and thought Kill La Kill was just fine, I enjoyed this movie a lot. I wouldn't say it's one of my absolute favorites, but I can definitely see myself going back and watching this movie again a couple times. Like I said, though, I can definitely understand how some people couldn't like it, or why some people wouldn't like it, especially if they're not willing to put up with the sort of Studio Trigger nonsense that is abound in this movie. So getting into a bit more specifics, I'm going to start with the first comment that I made when the movie was over, and the first comment that the person I saw the movie with made when the movie was over, and that is that this movie is beautiful. the art style is really unique, and they really commit to the art style throughout the whole movie. If you've seen any of the trailers for this movie, and if you haven't seen any of the trailers for this movie, I would definitely recommend going and taking a look at some of them. But if you've seen the trailers for this movie, that's the kind of art style you're going to get throughout the whole movie. It's just, I can't really describe it. I'm not very good at describing art styles, but it's really unique. And honestly, I would almost liken this to Into the Spider-Verse, not in terms of how the actual art style looks, but in terms of how committed the team very obviously was to making this art style look really good and carrying it throughout the whole film, whether during action scenes or slowed down scenes. There is a bit of a caveat to that, which is that there was one scene shortly into the second half of the movie where the character designs suddenly got a little bit more simplistic and a little bit more rough looking, and I wasn't super big of a fan of that. But that only lasts for maybe 5-10 minutes, and the rest of the movie looks absolutely amazing. Also, the soundtrack for this movie is top-notch. It's scored by Hiroyuki Sawano, who is a very popular composer among the anime scene. You may be familiar with his composition from Attack on Titan, Xenoblade Chronicles X. I'm trying to think of some of the other things he did. Oh, geez. I know he did Blue Exorcist, which isn't the most popular in the world, but if you've seen that, he did the score for that. He did the score for Recreators, which is also not the most popular in the world, but he did score it. The ones you're probably going to know him from, if you know of him, are Attack on Titan and Xenoblade Chronicles X. And something that I and some other people give Hiroyuki Sawano a little bit of flack for is he basically writes the same 5 songs over and over again. Don't get me wrong, they're 5 absolutely phenomenal songs, but it really does feel like the same 5 songs over and over again. So this soundtrack is going to sound a lot like any of his other work that you might have heard. I almost guarantee that you're going to be reminded of those if you've experienced them when you're watching this movie. The one exception I'll give is, I believe the piece is called Superfly. It's the theme of the rival character, and it is, in the official English trailer, it's the last piece that plays like during the last part of the trailer and during the title card for the movie at the end of the trailer. It's my favorite piece in the whole movie by far, and it honestly, I should really have looked this up, but it really doesn't sound like a Sawano piece. So I think somebody else might have written it. I'm not positive. Like I said, I should have looked it up. I didn't. But it sounds very distinct, and it sounds very good. So, in terms of visuals and soundtrack, this movie is incredible. So, the movie kicks off, I should explain the premise of the movie. I realize now that I never actually explained what the premise of the movie is. The premise of the movie is that 30 years prior to the events of the movie, a bunch of people suddenly developed pyrokinetic powers, those being the ability to start fires and manipulate fire with your mind. That's what pyrokinesis is. So, the 30 years prior to the events of this story, a bunch of people developed pyrokinetic powers and became known as the Burnish. And ever since then, a lot of the Burnish can't really control their powers too well, so they caused a lot of damage, and as a result, they're very not well liked. So a lot of Burnish are basically considered terrorists on sight, and they're hunted down and imprisoned so that they don't cause damage or harm to the general populace. So the movie focuses on a firefighter named Gallo and his encounters with the Burnish terrorist group Mad Burnish that cause him to become more and more sympathetic to the Burnish cause as the movie goes on. So the opening scene of the movie is Gallo's first encounter with the Mad Burnish, and that's when you get introduced to the two leads, Gallo and Leo, Leo being the leader of the Mad Burnish. And I have to admit, when I saw this scene, I was getting a little bit worried about how the pacing of the movie would be, because if you've seen, for example, the first episode of Kill La Kill, the opening scene of the movie was paced very much like that. It gives you a very short, cursory flyover shot, basically, a series of shots of the world, sort of to get you acclimated to the art style, and then boom, there's an explosion, and Gallo and his unit are fighting the Mad Burnish. And the scene goes really fast. Like, there's things happening all over the place all the time, and there's barely any breathing room in the scene, and it reminded me a lot of the first episode of Kill La Kill. And at that point, I was kind of worried about how the pacing of the movie would be, but I am very happy to say that that was not a problem at all, because this movie absolutely knows when to slow down and when to pick things back up. Immediately after that opening scene, well, at the end of that opening scene, Gallo is able to help capture Leo and the other two Mad Burnish that are with him and send him to prison. And immediately when that scene is over, the movie just hits its brakes, and there's a really slow, really somber, really powerful scene where Leo is being escorted into prison, and you see the other Burnish that are locked up in there, and they're all like bandaged up, and you see children with bandages all over them, and these just really sad look in their eyes, and the movie just takes this scene so slow and gives the audience the chance to breathe and really absorb all of the emotion from this scene. And honestly, it's one of the more memorable scenes in the movie for that reason. So mainly for the first half, but really for the entire movie, the pacing was not nearly the problem that I thought it was going to be when I first started. The second half of the movie does pick the pacing up a little bit more. It has a lot more of those quick, snappy moments and a lot few of the slower, more drawn out, more emotional moments. But I mean, it's excusable because the movie is pushing towards its climax at that point. So another thing you'll notice a lot of in this movie is that this movie has a lot of humor. And honestly, I think the humor in this movie, most of it at least, lands really well. I honestly cannot remember a single joke in the movie that didn't have at least a fair amount of the audience laughing out loud when I watched this in the theater. So the movie, the humor in this movie, it's funny. It lands well. The one slight issue I have with it, or the one slight issue I could see people having with it, is that a lot of the humor is spliced into more serious scenes to provide a little bit of comic relief in the really serious scenes. So, for example, in the second half of the movie, I hate to keep bringing up the second half of the movie over and over again, but like I said, if you're going to have problems with the movie, that's probably where they're going to be. In the second half of the movie, there's a big exposition dump where you're finding a lot out about the villain and the world of this movie and how everything came to be this way. And there's a repeated gag where Gallo keeps falling asleep in the middle of this exposition and waking up, but still being on top of things, still knowing what's going on, even though he was just asleep. So, I mean, the scene is played well, or the humor is played well. The humor is funny, but in that specific instance, and in a couple of other instances, I just don't feel like the humor really belonged where it was. So, I mean, the humor is a bit hit or miss. Like I said, it lands well, it's funny, I just don't think it's in the right places. So just a second ago, I mentioned the villain. And the villain is something I want to talk about here. I won't say who the villain is because it's a twist villain. And honestly saying that, just knowing it's a twist villain, you can probably figure out who the villain is very shortly into the movie. And even if you can't, the villain is revealed like 30 or maybe even less minutes into the movie, so it's not like a really late game twist. It's about a quarter of the way into the movie that you find out who the villain is, but it is played as a twist, so I won't spoil it here. But the villain is a really interesting case here, because the thing is, the villain is right. The villain has really solid motivations and honestly a really reasonable plan that I could genuinely see someone in the real world backed into this situation that the villain is in. I could really see a real person making these kinds of decisions that the villain makes to solve this situation. So I feel like the villain really had an opportunity to be a really interesting and really emotionally complex villain, but I feel like that's undercut a little bit by how, other than his motivation and his plan, how blatantly terrible of a person this villain is. I really felt like if the villain was played a little bit different, if the villain was written a little bit different, I could really have connected a lot closer with the villain and really felt a lot more strongly for the villain. But I mean, he's really just portrayed as blatantly evil after the twist happens, and I'm gonna be honest, that just really wasn't for me, especially since we had another megalomaniacal, terrible person villain that the movie kind of just felt like it forgot about later on. So I feel like these villains are too similar to be two separate characters, and if they wanted them as two separate characters, I really feel like the main villain of the movie should have been written a bit differently. Should have been written as a bit more sympathetic. The example I want to bring up here is Rossyu from Gurren Lagann, because I feel like the villain really had the potential to become the next Rossyu if he was written a bit differently. Rossyu was the best written villain in Gurren Lagann, and I will die on that hill. Rossyu was an amazing villain, but we're not here to talk about Gurren Lagann, we're here to talk about Promare. So let's talk about Promare. I think the villain could have been played a bit better, but really that's just a matter of personal taste for me. I can definitely understand someone preferring this style of villain over Rossyu, for reasons that will become clear if you decide to watch the movie. I probably should have mentioned earlier that I plan on splitting this review up into a spoiler segment, or a non-spoiler segment, which is what we're deep into now at this point, and a spoiler segment. So I'll let you know when the spoilers are coming up. Don't worry about that. I'll discuss the villain a bit more in the spoiler segment. So if you want to know my full thoughts on the villain, and you don't mind getting spoiled, stick around for that. But for now, I didn't like the villain too much, but it's really just a matter of personal taste. I can understand someone really liking this villain. So I'm not going to hold that against the movie. It just didn't cater to me specifically. All of that being said, the first half of the movie is, like I said, really amazing. And there's really a lot to like in the second half of the movie too, but there was also a lot that I didn't like too much, and I feel like that could really bring the experience down for other people. Another thing I wanted to mention a little bit earlier on is that Gallo and Leo, the two leads of the movie, really played off really well together. Also, if you've seen or heard all the comparisons between Gallo and Kamina, Gallo is literally Kamina. I'm not going to beat around the bush on that one. Gallo is literally Kamina. Honestly, I'm not going to hold that against the movie. I feel like he was portrayed pretty well here. I was worried going in because I wondered how... Don't get me wrong, I love Kamina, but the thing is, he's so clearly built to facilitate other people's character arcs rather than stand alone as his own character, that I really wondered how they were going to make a Kamina-like character into the main protagonist of the movie, but I feel like they pulled that off much better than I expected to. I won't say it was perfect, but it did go really well. Ultimately, I thought that Gallo was a pretty good choice for the main protagonist of the movie. Also, there's an interesting aspect of this world that they've built up, where kind of firefighters are kind of seen as celebrities. And that kind of makes sense in the context of this world, because I mean, in a world where you have pyrokinetics and a lot of terrorism is perpetrated through fire, and even non-terrorism, sometimes there's just fire outbreaks that the Burnish responsible for didn't intend to. And I think in that context, it's a really interesting portrayal of firefighters as celebrities, because I think that makes a lot of sense in this world that they've built, and it also gives Gallo a lot more opportunities to stroke his ego, so it kind of makes sense in that sort of context how Gallo became such an egotistical kind of guy. But another way that they handled him well was to give him kind of a foil in the form of Leo. The other main lead, the former leader of Mad Burnish, I guess he's not really former because Mad Burnish kind of exists throughout the whole movie. The leader of Mad Burnish, Leo, the two leads do play off of each other really well. One thing I wish was that we had gotten more interaction between these two, because I kind of feel like Gallo was more won over by the Burnish cause in general than he was by Leo specifically. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't want to say it like it's a bad thing, but I feel like it would have been a bit more interesting, and it would have gotten people a bit more invested in these characters if they did have more interaction between Gallo and Leo. That being said, though, the interactions we do get between them are great. One example I like to give of that is towards the end of the movie. Rather, in the climax of the movie, there's a scene where Gallo starts giving cool-sounding names to everything, and Leo which is a very Kamina thing to do, if you aren't aware. So Gallo starts giving all these cool-sounding names to everything, and Leo keeps calling him out on it, like, this isn't the time and place to do that. And I like how that dynamic evolved into Leo eventually saying, look, we need to get this stuff done, and if this is how we're going to get it done, then so be it. So it was really fun to watch those two interact. I feel like we should have gotten more. There was also... So I'm going to talk a bit more about the second half of the movie now. There was a scene that I felt like was the climax of the movie when I was watching it, and I felt like the movie had been really short, and then as soon as that scene ended, I checked the clock and noticed that the movie was only slightly over halfway over. So the divide between the first and second halves of the movie is really sharp. Is that big scene in the middle that really does feel like the climax of the movie until the scene ends and nothing really got resolved, or not much got resolved, at least. And at that point is when things begin to become a little bit shaky. That's the point where you get the big exposition dump, and you start getting some of the Deus Ex Machina and some of the other Studio Trigger silliness. And that's where there's a big exposition dump, and there's a twist in that exposition dump, which I don't want to say right now. I'm going to talk about it in the spoiler bit. But that twist in that exposition dump is probably my biggest problem with the movie. It just kind of came out of nowhere and felt kind of silly, and I just didn't care for it a ton. Like I said, I'm not going to say what it is right now because I don't want to spoil, but just I don't honestly, I don't remember where I was going with that. There's a twist in the second part of the movie, shortly into the second half of the movie, that I didn't particularly care for. And that's also a lot of where we get to see how genuinely terrible of a villain, or of a person, the villain actually is. So that scene, it's just not my favorite in the movie. That's the same scene that I talked about with the animation becoming a bit rougher, and that's the same scene I talked about with Gallo repeatedly falling asleep and waking back up. So honestly, I'd say out of the whole movie, that scene is probably the weakest of the bunch. And honestly, I feel bad saying that my enjoyment of the movie was negatively impacted by just one scene, but it carries so many ramifications for the rest of the story that it's really hard to overlook it. So, with that being said, I am going to transition into the spoiler bit right now. It should be a lot shorter than what I've already said, but if you don't want to be spoiled for the movie, leave now. And I'll give you a couple seconds to do that and be back in a moment. So, if you're still here, I am going to assume that you either have seen the movie already or don't really care about spoilers for it. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about that big exposition scene that honestly I felt kind of dragged the whole movie down. The first thing I want to talk about, so the twist villain that I mentioned, the twist villain is named Governor Cray Forsyth. And at the very start of the movie, he's sort of Gallo's father figure, sort of role model mentor figure. But then he just has this moment where he switches over to this really evil persona. And, like, he starts saying things like, oh, I've never liked you, Gallo. I've never respected you. You were always an eyesore for me. And in this exposition scene in the second half of the movie, you find out that he murdered his own mentor. He's been stealing a lot of his own mentor's technology for himself to make himself look good. And he's just really megalomaniacal. And it felt like, while I did say earlier that his plan makes sense, his plan is reasonable, it's obviously not the greatest possible outcome, thus him being the villain of the movie and this plan being something that Gallo and Leo want to stop. But it felt like I was never convinced that he had really taken time to actually try any better alternatives of this plan. He wanted to be the one to save the world, and he wanted everyone to know that he was the one who saved the world. And that was kind of his whole thing. And I feel like that kind of injured his character as a whole. A parallel I'll draw with this is to if you've seen the latest live action Spider Man, which is at the time of recording, Spider Man Far From Home. He almost reminds me of Mysterio a little bit, but the difference between him and Mysterio is while Mysterio. I should have put in a big spoiler warning for that Spider Man movie here. So if you haven't seen that Spider Man movie and care about getting spoiled, sorry, but also if you didn't know that Mysterio was going to be a villain, then, I mean, were you really paying attention? Anyway, I would liken him to Mysterio, whereas they're both being the heroes specifically because they want to reap the rewards of being seen as a hero rather than actually wanting to do the right thing. But why I would say it works for Mysterio and less so for Cray is because Mysterio manufactured the whole situation that he was saving everyone from, whereas Cray, there's a real problem that he's solving that didn't come from him. It came from something else in this big scene that I'm about to mention soon. And I feel like they kind of tried to have their cake and eat it too in that situation where the villain has genuinely good or genuine motivations but is doing it for fame and glory rather than to, actually do good things. I can see how people would say that worked, but it didn't work for me personally. So that's, like I said, that's just a personal gripe. I don't hold it against the movie. That's just something that I wanted to note. So the twist that I mentioned in this exposition scene, and honestly, it's the biggest problem I have with the movie. It's the aliens. Yes, just like in Gurren Lagann and just like in Kill la Kill, it's all because of aliens. And I really should have seen that coming in hindsight, but in the moment, it just kind of felt like it came out of nowhere and it just felt kind of silly. So the whole thing is that there is a race of aliens called Promare, thus the title of the movie, that are sentient fire, and they are aliens from another dimension who came through a rupture in space-time to inhabit the core of the Earth, and that's what's giving the Burnish their powers. But because of something that honestly doesn't really go that explained, they're also causing a bunch of volcanic eruptions, and the Burnish using their power accelerates the rate of volcanic eruptions, and eventually it's going to get to the point where lava just covers the earth and kills everyone, which is the situation that the villain is trying to prevent. It's not super clear whether he actually knows that the Promare are responsible for this or not, but actually, no. Now that I think about it, I believe that later in the movie it is confirmed that he does know about the Promare and know that they're responsible for this whole thing. So, ignore what I just said. I feel like there are better ways to do it than aliens. And something that really struck me was there was in the version of the movie I saw after the credits, there was a round table with some people from Studio Trigger to talk about the movie, answer a couple of questions about it. And at one point, one of them mentioned that I believe the director or producer had the idea, or one of the earlier ideas for the movie was to have a race of aliens that could only communicate through burning things, and that the story kind of evolved around that. It did not feel that way to me at all. It really felt like the Promare were some sort of last second addition into the story that to just explain everything away. And I really felt like they didn't need to be there. And I really felt like if they wanted them to be there, they should have explored that whole idea a bit more. I feel like they're kind of just brought up, and then you're just supposed to keep them in the back of your mind, and they're mentioned like a couple times throughout the rest of the movie. So that just felt really weird to me. And then that brings me to the ending of the movie. The ending of the movie, let me answer the questions that I'm sure you have on your mind. Is there a drill? Yes, there's a drill. Do the robots get progressively bigger throughout the course of the movie? Yes, the robots get progressively bigger throughout the course of the movie. Do the two male leads kiss? It's called a rescue breath. So those are the important questions out of the way. But I want to go into a little bit more detail on the ending. So at the end of the movie, they're fighting against Cray in his own big robot suit. And eventually, we get this concept introduced of flames that the Burnish are able to create that protect people instead of burning stuff down. And that's just, I don't really know. That felt a little bit awkward, but it didn't feel like it came nearly out of nowhere as much as the aliens did. But the idea of the Burnish being able to make this protecting flame instead of a destructive flame. So that winds up being how they resolve the whole problem. There's some hand-wavy explanation of the Promare making all of these volcanic eruptions because they want to burn but are being restricted from doing so. And so how they solve the whole thing is that Gallo and Leo are co-piloting this one big robot at this point, and the robot just becomes a really big, like, planet-sized robot made out of fire. And the great big planet-sized robot starts punching the Earth, and that covers the Earth with one of the protective flames. And because that wasn't enough, Leo uses his own powers to create this fire dragon thing, which is something that he had been doing throughout the course of the movie. A lot of his more flashy fire attacks, he makes a big dragon out of fire and then makes that dragon breathe more fire. It looks really cool. Like, it's really amazing to look at. I don't want to make fun of it, but in this specific instance, he creates a really big fire dragon and launches it into the sun. And the blast of this giant fire dragon getting launched into the sun bathes the whole solar system in the protective fire. And because the Promare were finally able to fulfill their need to burn, they go back through the dimensional rupture, and the dimensional rupture is closed, and all of the volcanoes start erupting and Burnish don't exist anymore. So you see what I'm talking about with kind of studio trigger nonsense that the ending kind of pulls? Like the person I watched it with said, that's a very studio trigger ending. There's a lot of weird deus ex machina. There's a lot of spectacle for spectacle's sake, last second power-ups. So I can definitely understand that the climax of the movie disrupting someone's enjoyment of the movie. That being said, though, when I was watching it, I was getting really caught up in the moment. Like, I was recognizing that it was silly and goofy, but at that point, I just kind of had a turn your brain off moment, and I turned my brain off and said, haha, cool fire robots punching each other, isn't that cool? And just kind of basked in the spectacle, and Usually I have a problem with media that can only really be enjoyed if you turn your brain off, or not necessarily that, but more people who say, oh, just turn your brain off and you'll like it more, stop overthinking everything. But in this case, I feel like if you do that in this finale, you're gonna have a lot of fun. But if you don't do that, the exact opposite is going to happen, and honestly, I could really understand this final scene really hindering your enjoyment of the movie as a whole. So, all of that being said, it's difficult for me to really do like a widespread recommendation of this, because you kind of have to know what you're getting into to really get the full experience out of it. So like I said at the beginning of the review, if you have seen Gurren Lagann or Kill la Kill and enjoyed them, you're probably going to enjoy this movie too. If there was stuff, especially at the end of either of those series, that you really, really didn't like, you're probably going to see the same things in this movie and really, really not like them. But if you are completely unfamiliar with both of those series and just want to give it a shot, I'd encourage you to do so, because I think there's a lot of fun and enjoyment to be gotten out of this movie. I can understand why people wouldn't like it, but I had a lot of fun with it. I think it's a good movie. It's a solid first attempt for a movie from Studio Trigger. The one thing I think I can say is that this movie really would have been serviced well by being a, say, 6-episode TV miniseries instead. Yes, that would impact the budget probably, and would make the animation less good, which would be a huge detriment to the movie. But at the same time, I feel like it would give the writers a lot more time to explore these ideas, because you'll notice that the two biggest complaints I have about this movie are that things aren't explored as much as I wanted them to be. And seeing as it's already a 2-hour movie, I wouldn't really expect them to devote more time to exploring these things in a movie setting. So it's really kind of a trade-off. Do you want the animation quality, or do you want the better writing? I'm greedy and I want them both. But I just don't think this specific story was in a position where it could have had both. They tried to have their cake and eat it too, and I feel like the movie suffered in a couple of places because of that. But overall, I thought it was a solid movie. It was a good first showing. I am really looking forward to more Studio Trigger movies in the future. I hope they can sand out some of the bad spots of this movie. I hope they can enhance the good stuff even more. And I'm really hoping that they'll learn from what they've done in this movie and carry on with an even better one in the future. So, that's what I thought of Promare. If you want to tell me what you thought of Promare, or if you're going to go see it, or, well, I mean, it's pretty much out of theaters now as far as I'm aware, but if you are planning on seeing it when it eventually comes out on like DVD or a streaming service, there's a nice big comment section hanging out right below this video that would be a great place for you to do that. But that's pretty much all I had for now, so I will, don't worry, this isn't going to take the place of or interrupt my normal upload schedule for my other videos, so don't worry about that. But stay tuned for more So I Just Watched in the future, and I will see you when I see you.